After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the main processes of memory, to describe about different memory processes, encoding, consolidation, storage, retrieval, to explain why forgetting happens, to discuss different theories of forgetting.
After studying this module, you should be able to first understand the main processes of memory. Second, describe how different memory processes, that is encoding, consolidation, storage, retrieval, happens. Third, explain why forgetting happens. And finally, discuss different theories of forgetting. We have already looked at the different stages of memory formation, from perception to sensory memory, to short-term memory and to long-term memory in the section on types of memory. This section, however, looks at the overall processes involved. Memory is the ability to encode, store and recall information. Memory is a process, but it also has a place in the brain as well. The three main processes involved in human memory are encoding, storage and recall, that is retrieval. Additionally, the process of memory consolidation, which can be considered to be either part of the encoding process or the storage process, is treated here as a separate process in its own right.
Let's understand what memory process is all about. There are different models of how memory works. All of them basically involve the same three processes. So, no matter if you use any of the modules or the models, but there would be one specific goal towards that models. It would be your encoding, storage, retrieval. Let us understand each step in detail now. First, putting it in, that is encoding. The first step in memory process is to get sensory information. So, what is the sensory information? It will include all which is there of sight, sound, into a form that brain can use, a process called encoding. So, when we read this definition of encoding or when we hear this thing, so there are two things which is coming out from this definition. First is your sensory information and second part includes the brain use. So, when an information is there, your senses start playing a role to process that information. Your senses can be, it could be any visual object or something which you have heard. So, your brain will start using its own mechanisms to understand that information which is there. It will, your electrical neurons will start working, that information will be passed from the information which is the auditory information. Your brain will start processing that auditory information what you have heard. So, two aspects which we have seen in encoding would be your auditory, any information, sensory information, not exactly auditory, it could be visual also, and brain will use it further to understand, to give meaning to those sensory informations. It is a set of mental operations that are performed by people to convert the sensory information into a form that is usable in the brain storage system. This is what we have said, that whatever information we are getting through our senses, maybe through auditory, maybe through our visual aspects, our brain will process it further so that it can be stored in that manner which could be understood by people very easily. For example, whenever people hear a sound, the ears turn the vibrations in the air into neural passages from the auditory nerve, which makes it possible for the brain to interpret that sound. So, it is a kind of a process, it is kind of a loop which goes through. Therefore, encoding is a crucial first step to creating a new memory. So, until unless you have that information around you, how are you going to process it? So, you need to have some kind of information on which you would be further focusing, further elaborating, further remembering. So, when that first step is not there, how are you going to go to the first floor? So, First step, second step, then only you would be able to reach your destination. So encoding is that first crucial step which will help you to process the information further on, which would be like stored within the brain system, and that would be within the brain and then recalled later from short term memory or the long term memory. So the role of short term, long term will come later on. Encoding is a biological event which starts through our senses, where perception is further activated. The process of putting information in memory begins with attention, regulated by thalamus and the frontal lobe. So these are the parts of the brain which helps in basically understanding the information and putting it into some kind of a coded information which could be understood by individuals. Encoding can take on different levels. The first step being the formation of short term memory from the ultra short term sensory memory, followed by the conversion to a long term memory by the process of memory consolidation. The processes begins with the creation in a memory trace or engram in response to the external stimuli. An engram is a biophysical or biochemical change in the neurons of the brain. So therefore encoding is not limited to turning sensory information into signals for the brain, but instead it can take on different forms in each of 3 different storage systems or storage of memory. There are 4 main types of encoding. First is acoustic encoding, which could be your auditory basis. It could be through sounds. It could be any words which you hear. So all other types, sounds, words, anything which is related to your auditory aspect would be covered in this area. And it is also within our, which allows input within our echoic memory to be subvocally rehearsed. So whatever information you hear, you try and subvocally rehearse that thing, that if you meet somebody in a party and that person tells you his or her name, you try and say his name again and again so that you don't forget the name of a person. So that was an auditory aspect. But another aspect which is involved in encoding is through visual aspect, visual encoding. Visual encoding is the process of encoding images and visually sensory information. So when you heard a name of a person, you will try and see his face, you will try and remember the person by his looks, by how that person was, whether the person was wearing specs or not, what kind of a face structure he had or she had, what haircut he or she had. So all these information will be included in your visual aspect. Visual sensory information is temporarily stored within the echoic memory before being encoded into long-term memory. So all these information would be in a form of visual aspects, visual sensory, and it could be the visual antenna which you would be taking out here. Third type of encoding would be your tactile encoding, and it is the encoding of how something feels normally through the sense of touch. So anything which you feel soft, hard, so it's a way of basically sensing that information, storing that information in that form. You can take an example of the books which are available for the kids. Small children are being taught that this is hard, this is soft, this is rough, this is what it looks like, a paper. So all these things can be taught through these books, and market is full of these books where you are able to say this is a soft touch of a teddy bear, this is a touch of a granules, tiles, wood. So all these things could be associated with encoding how you would associate that bear, teddy bear is basically soft and soft touch is there. So all these things are associated with their tactile encoding. And last is the semantic encoding. Semantic encoding is the process of encoding sensory input that has particular meaning or can be applied to a particular context rather than derived from particular sense. So anything which holds meaning, you will try and remember that information in that manner. It could be something, it could be any context which is related to. So you hold that information through certain meaning. Meaningful context is being encoded rather than any hick and man information which is coming around you. You don't process all the information, you only process which holds context or which can be applied further on. Now let's try and understand these concepts in detail also. When we have addressed encoding, there is another concept called consolidation. So what is consolidation? Consolidation is a process of stabilizing a memory trace after the initial acquisition. It is an active part for encoding and storage of any information. So what we had said earlier, that some have been referred it to be as a part of encoding and storage, but out here we would be addressing it in a separate way, so that it's more easier for you to understand what consolidation would be all about. It is the second step in the memory process. It further includes two specific processes: synaptic consolidation and system consolidation. These are the two things which we need to understand out here in consolidation. Synaptic consolidation, which occurs within the first few hours after learning or encoding, whereas system consolidation, basically where hippocampus dependent memories become independent of the hippocampus over a period of weeks to years. So the difference between two would be few hours, and the next would be for years, weeks or years. This process works only with a phenomenon called potentiation, and potentiation is a process by which firing of neurons make those neurons more inclined to fire the other ones or to fire together in the future, so that the combination is made. When an information is there, you try and club all the information which is around you, so that further you can remember those information in a much better manner. The third step which would be there in memory is your memory storage. You try and hold on to the information for some period of time, a process called storage. As we had discussed about how it is stored in different ways, sensory, short-term memory and long-term memory, all three would be having different storage systems depending on the stages of memory being used. For example, in one stage of memory, people hold information not just long enough to work within it, which might be about 20 seconds or so. In another stage, people might hold information for more or less permanently. That information will not be lost, it would be there within the system, and some information might be just lost within few seconds. Storage is a process or less passive process of retaining information in the brain, whether it is sensory memory, the short-term memory, or the long-term memory as a permanent memory it is being referred as. Each of these different stages of human memory function as a sort of filter that helps us to protect from the flood of information that confront us on the daily basis. So avoiding an overload of information, it is the best technique, best way. When we store information, we don't take all the information which is around us, around the environment. We try and focus the information which is important to us, and that information is further processed with its importance. If it is important for me, I will take that information to short term. I will try and take that information to a longer term basis also if it's very important for me. But if that information is just for the time being, I will leave that information and move forward. So that concept is basically storage, where overloading of information is not there. That so many information is there, what should I do now, how should I refer to it? So this will help you in overcoming this overloading of information. Now getting it out, retrieval. The last step in the memory processes is how that information is to be retrieved or recalled. You have stored information. First, you have encoded that information in a manner which can be stored in some form. Then when you have stored that information, you need to recall it. That now, if I'm asking you who is the Prime Minister of India, so you need to information which you have stored earlier. First, you have encoded in some manner about the face, the vocals, the sound of a person. Then you have taken with that of his storage would be with his personality or any other information which you have said, elaborated in that manner. Now you would recall that information in some way or the other. So when you have to recall that information, basically you will use all the first previous steps which you had taken, and now the recall of information would be there. If you're not able to recall that information, that means you have never stored that information in the first place. So recall or retrieval of memory refers to subsequent reassessing of events or information from the past which have been previously encoded and stored in the brain. It is one of the three core processes of memory. Recall is simply bringing a thought or idea learned previously and thus stored in memory into conscious awareness. You would also recall, another example would be when you have to complete an essay exam. You are recalling information learned previously This is different than a recognition in which you only need to identify material you learned previously. Example, multiple choice questions. So you need to learn other informations which are there. Because of ways memories are encoded and stored, memory recall works effectively in a reconstruction of elements which are present throughout various areas of the brain. Memories are not stored in our brain. It looks like library. It has shelves or even has collection of self-contained recordings or pictures or videos. So, but maybe better thought of kind of a collage or a jigsaw puzzle involving different elements stored in distinct parts of the brain linked together with association or neural networks. So you try and recall that information in these manners, you try and make a puzzle out of it, you try and remember with certain events, you try and remember with certain, as the house is yours, like, okay, this is my dining room, this information will be stored according to this area. So you try and associate the areas out here of your house also with rooms association. Now we would be, the another would be the evidence suggests that memory retrieval is basically more or less an automatic process. Through distractions or divided attention at the time of recall tends to slow down the retrieval process to some extent. It basically typically has little or no effect on the accuracy of retrieved memories. So distraction at the time of encoding, on the other hand, can severely impair subsequent retrieval cues. So if you were remembering an event and some distraction must have followed, or it has occurred during that process of encoding that information, that distraction might play an impact or might affect you in retrieval cues. There are three main types of recall: free recall, cued recall, serial recall. Let's take them one by one. What is free recall? It is a process in which a person is given a list of items to remember and then asked to recall them in any order. So it could be, if I am giving you 10 names and I would be telling you to remember those 10 names. It could be in any manner, in any order you can recall those 10 names. I am not giving you any specification out here that it should be first name should be at the first place, second name should be at the second place. It could be in any order, any way you can recall those names. This type of recall often displays evidence of either primacy effect or recency effect. Primacy would be when the person recall items presented at the beginning, and recency would be at the end. So the middle would be left out. Either you would be able to remember the first contents, few ones which you have learnt earlier, and the last ones which you had remembered recent would be your recency effect. Cued recall is the next recall which we would be addressing out here. Cued recall is a process in which a person is given a list of items to remember, and it is then tested with the use of cues or guides. Supposingly you need to remember the names or items, certain items which are there in your list, that would be associated with some kind of a cue. It would be attached to some kind of a cue, and then you have to recall those items. It could be with sounds, it could be with light, it could be with any kind of a cue which is given to you with that aspect. Next is the serial recall. Serial recall refers to the ability to recall items or events in the order in which they have occurred. Maybe the events, certain events, historical events, that would be in the serial order, that this happened in this year, then this thing happened. So it would be a serial recall, serial manner. If supposedly there are 1 to 10 items, you have been told to remember those 1 to 10 items, you need to remember those items in the same manner as it is presented to you. Maybe number 1 would be any name of a person, maybe X, Y, A, B. So you need to remember them in that same order only. It's not like free recall, what we had discussed about earlier, that you can remember them in any manner. It would be a serial, it should be in a serial manner or serial event. Their testing of serial recall by psychologists have yielded generally several general rules. There are certain rules which you need to follow. More recent events are more likely to be remembered easily in order to, especially with auditory in the same order, which would hold your auditory stimuli. Recall decreases as the length of the list or sequence increases. So when the length is there, the recall would decrease as and when, if supposingly if there are more than 10 numbers or 10 lists which more than 10 names of the items are to be remembered, it will take more time for you to recall, or the recall would not be as good as the length was less. There is a tendency to remember the correct items but in the wrong order. When errors are made, there is a tendency to respond with an item that resembles the original item. In some way, errors do occur, but they are relatively rare. If an item is recalled earlier in the list, then it should not be than it should be. The missed item tends to be inserted immediately after it. If an item from a previous trial is recalled in a current trial, it is likely to be recalled at its position from the original trial. So these were the general rules which were given by psychologists. And now let's understand what are how the encoding was successful. But it still can't remember. But you still can't remember that encoding was successful. You were able to encode the information. Storage happened. Encoding, but still that information is not coming out of the system. So why it happened? Newell Coward wrote a great romance, What Has Been is Past, What Has Been is Past, Forgetting. Alas, not true. All the memory processes are operating at every moment of the day. Typically, we are not aware of the functioning of memory until attempts to remember are met with failure. That is why we forget. So this is the reason, this is a mystery which lies in encoding was successful, but still we are not able to remember them, that forgetting has happened. Forgetting is the inability to recall or recognize previously encoded information. So you're not able to recall the information, you're not able to retrieve that information. When we are saying that although some instances of forgetting are due to poor initial encoding, and others are due to lack of the right cues at the right time. Many instances of forgetting result from post-encoding mechanisms. These mechanisms interfere with memory, or even if encoding was effective and the cues suitable, attempts to remember may be met with failure, as if the memory were lost. So basically, forgetting may be referred as a difference between what one has learned and what he has retained. Forgetting takes place at the retention stage, when you have to retain that information. Information is not forgotten if it has never been learned at the first place. So that information is still there within your system, but forgetting, if that information has not stored in that system, like in your sensory memory or short-term memory, it will not be forgotten. That means that information does not exist at all. If you have forgotten that information, that means you have not retrieval cues were not perfect enough, or you have not stored that information in a proper manner. Maybe organization was not there. If supposing another reason for forgetting due to limited storage capacity is also another reason for that. It could be very huge amount of information is there, but capacity is limited, storage capacity is limited. In short-term memory, it would be very less, 7 units would be there, plus minus 2 units can be done. But if more than that information is there, obviously some kind of a lapses would be there at that stage. There is a famous Ebbinghaus forgetting function, which a curve which they have discussed about. He was the first researcher to study forgetting. In his classic work, Memory, Ebbinghaus systematically examined how memory for encoded stimuli and event changes in the retention interval. The time between encoding and retrieval increases. He created several lists of nonsense syllabi, as he did not want any verbal association to aid in remembering. For this, they had used constant verbal constant concept, where nonsense syllabi was there which never had any meaning. For example, if you take meaningful words, it could be CAT, it was having constant verbal constant, where A is a vowel but still it holds the meaning of a cat. But if nonsense syllabi is to be made, it could be M, A, and it could be R. So MAR does not hold any meaning out here. So constant vowel constant, where this work was being done. So they had said that when nonsense syllabi is there, they never wanted to make it meaningful for them to remember. Anything which is nonsense, and how that information is retrieved or learned. That was a area where he was covering on. He observed that his memory for meaningless nonsense syllabi declined as the retention interval increased. The result has been plotted in the form of a graph, and which is called as the curve of forgetting. The graph shows that forgetting happens quickly within the first hour after learning the list and then tapers off gradually. Therefore, it was seen that testing of other information for forgetting was similar. Encoding failure, another concept which we should understand in this module. There might be several reasons by which we can forget things, and one of them is encoded failure. We have discussed about how the retention was there, but encoding failure would be through information which is not encoded in a proper format, or which is not remembered in a certain way. Information that has not passed through a sensory memory will have an encoding failure. It has been also said that this failure where information has not been processed is also called encoding failure. What are the different theories of encoding? First theory is the trace decay. Trace decay theory explains memories are stored in both short-term and long-term memory systems. According to this theory, short-term memory can only retain information for a limited amount of around 15 to 30 seconds, and then it could be, unless and until it has been rehearsed, that information will not be passed to the next step. So decay, fade away, and decay would gradually happen out here. Interference theory, the information which we have learned right now will be interfering with the earlier information, or the information which was earlier is interfering with our current information which we have learned now. It could be retroactive information or proactive. Retroactive would be learn A, learn B, recall when you have to recall A. So recall learning of B will interfere with your learning of A. So when you recall what you have learned right now is the B concept, you will recall what you have learned earlier one. So that is retroactive. Proactive would be you have learned A concept, you have learned B concept. Now you have to recall B, but that B recall would be interfered with your A1, that is the previous information. So retroactive interference occurs when previously learned information is lost because it is mixed up with new and somewhat similar information. For example, if you learn the contents of a chapter today, new information presented to you tomorrow could cause you to become confused about the chapters of the contents of this chapter. Retroactive interference occurs when information occurs backwards to interfere with the earlier information, just as a retroactive pay raise given in a July might work backwards to influence pay days from January to June. Now let's understand the types of forgetting, summary of what all we have done in forgetting. It could be proactive interference, then it could be through retroactive interference. So proactive, to summarize, would be current information is lost because it is mixed up with previous learned information. Retroactive, previously learned information is lost because it is mixed up with the new and somewhat similar information. Then mnemonic would be early information projects itself forward and interferes with what we try to learn next, and new information interferes with older information, much like retroactive pay raise previous paychecks, influences previous paychecks. So let's summarize what we have done in this module, the concepts which we have taken. Let's revise those concepts again in the end section. We have done the three main processes involved in memory, in human memory, are encoding, storage and recall. In this process is consolidation, which is considered to be either a part of encoding process or the storage process, is understood as a separate unit. The reason for that was also given. The first step in the process, memory process, is to get sensory information and to encode it in some form of a process. It could be in the brain. Then it is a set of mental operations that are performed by people to convert to sensory information. Then 4 types of encoding had been discussed in this module. They were acoustic encoding, tactile encoding, semantic encoding and visual encoding, all playing a role in converting sensory information. Consolidation is the second step in memory processes. Consolidation is a process of stabilizing a memory trace after the initial acquisition. It is an active part for encoding and storage of information. The next step in memory is to hold on to the information for some period of time or process called storage. Storage is a more or less passive process of retaining information in the brain. Recall or retrieval of information memory refers to subsequent reassessing of information or events from the past. Three main recall types were discussed. They were free recall, serial recall, and acute recall. The inability to recall stored information is called forgetting. This was further explained with two theories, decay and interference theory.
We can understand the memory processes through the following model. Environmental stimuli are all the things we notice in our surroundings. Using our senses, we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell a great deal each day. Sensory register, the information from the environment is stored very briefly, often for less than half a second in our sensory register. After information enters in sensory register, it goes through the process of attention, which is the behavioral and cognitive process of selectively concentrating on one aspect of the environment while ignoring other things. This information is sent to our brain in raw form, where perception comes into play. It is the way we interpret these sensations and therefore make sense of everything around us. Then information is sent to short term memory. Information is stored here for a few seconds. When information is transferred into long term memory, it goes through the three-step process. Firstly, encoding needs to be done, that is, the process of breaking the information down into a form we can understand. In order to store the information for a much longer time, we often need to rehearse or go over the information a number of times in our working memory. Secondly, it involves retrieval. It is the process of bringing stored information from long term memory to the conscious level in the short term memory. Finally, storage refers to the retention of information which has been achieved through the encoding process in the brain for a prolonged period of time until it is accessed through recall. The first step in memory process is to get sensory information, sight, sound, into a form that the brain can use, a process called encoding. It is a set of mental operations that are performed by people to convert the sensory information into a form that is usable in the brain's storage system. There are four main types of encoding, namely visual encoding, acoustic encoding, tactile encoding, and semantic encoding. Let us now understand them one by one. First is the visual encoding, which is the process of encoding images and visual sensory information. Second, acoustic encoding, which is the processing and encoding of sounds, words, and other auditory inputs for storage and later retrieval. Third, tactile encoding is the encoding of how something feels normally through the sense of touch. Last way for encoding is through semantic encoding, which is the process of encoding sensory input that has particular meaning or can be applied to a particular context. The second step in the memory process is consolidation. It is the process of stabilizing a memory trace after the initial acquisition. It is an active part for encoding and of storage of any information. It involves a process called potentiation. For example, if a piece of music is played over and over, the repeated firing of certain cells in a certain order in your brain makes it easier to repeat this firing later on, with the result that the musician becomes better at playing the music and can play it faster with fewer mistakes. The next step in memory is storage, which means to hold on to the information for some period of time. Storage is more or less passive process of retaining information in the brain, whether in the sensory memory, the short-term memory, or the more permanent long-term memory. The last step is one of the three core processes of memory, that is recall or retrieval process. Recall or retrieval of memory refers to the subsequent re-accessing of events or information from the past, which have been previously encoded and stored in the brain. Recall is simply bringing a thought or idea learned previously and thus stored in the memory into conscious awareness, whereas retrieval basically requires only the identification of the information that is already stored in our memory system. The next important aspect in retrieval is the process of relearning, which is a method to measure the amount of time that has been saved when we learn the information for the second time. Here, you shall be able to understand three main types of recall, namely free recall, queued recall, and serial recall. Let us understand them one by one. Free recall is the process in which a person is given a list of items to remember and then is asked to recall them in any order. As the name suggests, free. This type of recall often displays evidence of either the primacy effect, that is, when the person recalls items presented at the beginning of the list, whereas the recency effect is when the person recalls items presented at the end of the list. Second type of recall is the queued recall. It is the process in which a person is given a list of items to remember and is then tested with the use of cues or guides. Last is the serial recall, which refers to our ability to recall items or events in order in which they occurred, such as chronological events in our autobiographical memories. Forgetting is the inability to recall or recognize previously encoded information. Information is not forgotten if it has never been learned in the first place, and it is not considered forgotten if it is just inaccessible to retrieval, although it may be available in the memory. Information enters the human processing system via the different senses. Information not immediately attended to is held very briefly in a very temporary buffer memory called sensory memory. Since the capacity of this memory storage is so small, much information stored here gets decay. Now, information that is being selected then goes into short-term memory. The capacity of this memory storage is so small, much information stored here is lost because it is displaced by incoming items of information. Before information gets lost, however, some of the information can be retrieved and used, and that information passes to long term memory. In the long term memory, forgetting occurs as a problem of either availability failure, that is, information was never properly stored and therefore is not available, and accessibility failure, that is, information was properly stored but presently it cannot be accessed. Forgetting in the long term memory is the result mainly of accessibility rather than availability failure. You have understood what is forgetting. Let us now focus on why forgetting takes place. For this, two theories have emerged which try and explain the reasons for forgetting. First is the encoding failure theory, which says that sometimes forgetting is not really forgetting, but rather that the information never entered long term memory in the first place. Second, storage decay theory suggests that forgetting occurs because of a problem in the storage of the information. Hermann Ebbinghaus was the first researcher to study forgetting. He created several lists of nonsense syllables as he did not want any verbal association to aid in remembering. He observed that his memory for meaningless nonsense syllables declined as the retention interval increased. The result was plotted in a form of a graph which is called curve of forgetting. This graph clearly shows that forgetting happens quickly within the first hour after learning the lists and then tapers off gradually. Therefore, as seen in the figure above, forgetting is greater just after learning. In the following slides, we will understand interference theory. It states that forgetting occurs because memories interfere with and disrupt one another. There are two ways in which interference can cause forgetting. Retrospective interference. It occurs when you forget a previously learned task due to the learning of a new task. Now, we will understand retrospective interference with the help of following example. Suppose a student has studied economics first and then he studies psychology. So now the material studied for psychology interferes with the material studied for economics, and this will ultimately lead to poor performance on economics test. The interference being faced by the student is called retrospective interference. Another way in which interference causes forgetting is proactive interference. It occurs when you cannot learn a new task because of an old task that has been learned. Proactive interference can be explained with the help of following example. Suppose a student has studied material on psychology first and then he studies material on economics. Now, what is being studied earlier will interfere with the later learning. It will ultimately lead to poor performance on economics test because of previously learned material. It is known as proactive interference. In this module, you have learned about the three main processes involved in human memory. They are encoding, storage, and recall. You have also learned about four types of encoding in this module. They are acoustic encoding, tactile encoding, semantic encoding, and visual encoding, each step having its own role to play in memory. Later, we had discussed about how the encoded information which has been stored but still cannot be remembered, it is termed as forgetting. This was further explained with two theories. First, storage decay theory, and second, interference theory.